This idea then that people are just forced to keep saying voting until they say yes has also led to this idea perhaps that the EU should adopt the dual majority principle for treaty change like Switzerland. Unfortunately, what that would mean though, and that's very problematic, is it would be a real assault on national sovereignty. It's precisely the kind of thing that states are wary of. They don't want to lose out. They don't want to be outvoted in referendums by majorities from outside. You see that even still in Switzerland. It's also fundamentally against international law. The Vienna Convention on Treaties, fundamental precept of that is a state, a sovereign state, cannot be bound by a treaty it hasn't ratified. So that would constitute a full frontal assault on state sovereignty. So that would be really difficult to implement, because that's exactly what governments don't want to tell to their electorates. There's another element of direct democracy that's trying to be introduced in the EU, which is this thing called the Citizens' Initiative. It's sort of analogous, or modelled at least, on the popular initiative in Switzerland. So this is the idea then that you get 1 million signatories from across the EU to ask the executive, to ask the European Commission to address a particular policy question. But unlike in Switzerland, where in Switzerland that kind of initiative is legally binding and can actually change the whole constitution, what you see in the Citizens' Initiative contained in the Lisbon Treaty is that's non-binding legally and also can only apply and refer to a policy area where the EU is already competent. So it's not a way of changing the separation of powers in the EU system. Now the EU is also trying down the road of presidentialisation. We saw that with poor Herman Van Rompuy, this kind of unelected and deliberately bland figurehead. The question here though is, would an electoral mandate for that position actually make any difference? I would argue that it wouldn't. It certainly wouldn't guarantee success if you look at the reasons for the success of presidentialisation in the US. In the US, that presidentialisation, as I tried to say in my shortened version, was associated with, on the one hand, the creation of a cross-unit party system that was able to mobilise citizens. Think about the whole circus of presidential elections. That's a circus that doesn't just come from the late 20th century. That's a circus that comes from Andrew Jackson and his successors, creating a whole circus around the election of the president, based on mobilising citizens through parties. Also, presidentialisation is fundamentally associated with, in the US, this kind of popular acceptance of the constitutional jurisprudence of the Supreme Court. Prior to the Civil War, it's important to note the Supreme Court's role in terms of adjudicating separation of powers questions, at least horizontally, was really very much contested by the states. That's no longer really the case. Whereas in the EU, neither of these conditions really holds. In the EU, for the last 30 years, we've had direct elections to the European Parliament, which, as I say, is a very powerful lawmaking institution, and yet there's not been the creation of cross-unit parties across the whole continent. Rather, what we've seen is turnout for European parliamentary elections has basically dropped in every single country, including certain countries now that have a turnout of only 25% for those kinds of elections, which in Europe is a very low figure and reflective of the kind of mood associated with antagonism and despondency. So let me finish up now basically with some constitutional lessons for the EU to wrap it up with. And the key lessons, I think, is that the EU can't rely on courts alone to fix separation of powers issues. Courts obviously have their role in political debate, policy debate, but they're not really the institutions that are designed to have the last word politically. Think about this famous case, 1857. Who's this picture of?
Dred Scott.
Exactly. So Dred Scott, 1857. The moment when the sectional crisis in the US is really at its most intense. Think about Bleeding Kansas. What happens at this moment is the Supreme Court basically takes it upon itself to try and resolve the whole slavery question by adjudicating this decision of whether or not Dred Scott, who was a slave in the South, is being brought to a non-slave state, whether or not he remains a slave as well as his wife. Of course, the court rules that he does remain a slave, and this opens up a huge political cleavage that basically destroys the party system, the second party system. So I'm not for a minute suggesting that the EU faces this kind of crucial socio-economic or even moral cleavage, but it does suggest there's a real limitation of relying on the Supreme Court, a court system, to fix these separation of powers questions. It needs to be done in a political fashion, basically, through political constitutionalism, I would say. The second thing to bear in mind, then, is that reliance on elite consensus, that is, on elites coming together from the different member states to cut deals about what the separation of powers question is going to look like, which is traditionally how the EU has functioned, that's really not possible if the people don't trust their own national elites. And that's increasingly a problem because there's this increasing mistrust about what EU elites say are the benefits of European integration. Bear in mind then that at this level, the EU means different things in different countries. Think about it in France. European integration in France is seen basically as a kind of protective shield against globalization, projecting French power and making that French social model be protected against the ill effects of globalization. Compare that with what happens in Britain, my country. There, the EU is very much seen as a non-political phenomenon, a big free market that doesn't have political constraints as a result of that. It's just a free market enterprise. Think about a country like Italy. European integration there is seen as a way of stabilizing what is a democratically fragile country in a certain sense. The political system in Italy is fragile. EU helps stabilize that and provides a spur for economic growth. But in all those countries, it's becoming harder and harder for elites to actually keep selling those visions because those visions seem to have real flaws. The EU is more than a market. It has political constraints. That's what Britons are experiencing. But France, it's not really enhancing French power much. If anything, it's enhancing German power. If you think then in Italy, has it really spurred economic growth in the last 10 years? Not really. So in this context, it's increasingly difficult for citizens to trust their own elites about the merits of European integration. Consequently, I think the EU still needs to find and still groping for a form of political constitutionalism. And it needs to do so in order to solve these constitutional issues in a democratic fashion. And the existing attempts I suggested then at doing so via presidentialization, via direct democracy, have been flawed. So there isn't much, I think, to hope for from there. Moreover, the absence of political constitutionalism, the absence of the ability to mobilize citizens, to get them to participate, to get them to legitimize these outcomes, is especially problematic if, it seems more and more likely, the European Court of Justice is going to have to render controversial jurisprudence. It's going to have to render verdicts on the extent to which European Union free market rules can be balanced against national welfare legislation, for instance. That's a real problem. Another problem, as I suggested before then, is this loss of confidence in national elites. Their ability to make deals, to resolve the separation of powers issues in a way that benefits European citizens in a tangible fashion. So I've gone through quite a lot of material. I don't want to have hit you with a sledgehammer. So let's just talk about a few conclusions, finally. What I would say is these are kind of projective conclusions, as I suggested I would talk originally about my final elements. So the first thing I think you can project in the future is constitutional stagnation. The EU quasi-federal system that I outlined right at the beginning isn't, I think, going to change much in the future. The separation of powers is pretty much settled there, I think. What you'll see as well then is a turn towards foreign policy. A turn towards using foreign policy to legitimize the system. Thinking that European citizens will benefit from policies internationally to do with international development, getting agreements on climate change even, getting agreements about energy security, delivering tangible results there will help legitimize the system. That's basically what Van Rompuy's job is. Elected to provide a means of channeling, coordinating foreign policy. At the same time, what you're going to see then, because none of this is done really through political constitutionalism, through mobilization of citizens, you're going to see, I think, an increasingly vocal minority trying to contest the